It's Levi Brackman here with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining. This is the Torah portion uncensored section of this podcast series. And this Torah portion that we're talking about is Parshas Balak. Now, I'm going to do something a little bit different than what I usually do. But before I get into it, please, if you like this podcast, leave a review, like it wherever you listen to the podcast. Today, I'm going to talk about an ideological view of the Torah portion. What is it? Who wrote it, and what actually happened here? Was this a factual story or was it some kind of fiction? This might be considered to be controversial to some people because everyone thinks, of course, the Torah was dictated by God. If you are Orthodox, that's what you believe. But I'm going to base the view that I'm going to share here on the Talmud. But before I get into that, a quick overview of what the Torah portion of Balak is all about. So the story is that Balak was the king and the Israelites had encamped on his border, and he was very fearful that the Israelites would invade his country and take it over. So he goes to the prophet, the Gentile prophet called Balaam, and he asks him to come and curse the Jews. He sends messengers. Balaam says, wait till tonight and talk to God, and God will tell me whether I can curse the Jews or not. And God appears to him in the dream and says to him, you can't go with them. You cannot curse the Israelites. So he sends the messengers back to Balak. Balak again sends more messengers, more important people to Balaam to try and convince them to come and to curse the Israelites. Again, he says, wait, let me talk to God. He speaks to God, and God says, if you want to go, you can go, but you can only say that which I put in your mouth. You can't say anything different. So he goes with the messengers of Balak, and on the way, he's sitting on his jenny, on his donkey, and the donkey stops, and the donkey actually ends up hitting his leg against a wall because it was a very narrow alleyway which they were going down, and he ends up hitting the donkey 3 times to get it to move. Eventually, the donkey talks to Balaam and tells him, why are you hitting me? And then Balaam's eyes are opened and he sees there's an angel of God standing in front of him with a sword in his hand, and tells him, I could have killed you when you were saved by the donkey. Again, he says, you can only say that which God says you can say and not anything else. Eventually he goes with Balak, and he, instead of cursing the Jews, he ends up blessing the Jews. And that's the overview more or less of the story. You can go and read it for yourself in detail in Bamidbar Chav Beis onwards, Numbers chapter 22 onwards. What I want to talk about today is the authorship of this story. Because as a lot of biblical critics have shown, that this story seems like it's its own piece of literature, separate from the other pieces, both in style and in content. This is a whole story of not the Israelites. Moses is not in this story. The revelation does not happen to a Jewish prophet. The revelation of God happens to a Gentile prophet. So this seems to be a story which is a piece of literature on its own. And in fact, the rabbis seem to nod in that direction. We find in Masechtas Bava Batra, Tractate Bava Batra, page 14, which is Daf Yud Daladam Base, where it quotes a brisa, a Tanaitic piece of literature, where it says, Omi Kosvan, and who wrote them, and who wrote the scriptures, who wrote the Bible. And then it gives a list of who wrote which parts of the Bible. It says, Moshe Kosav Sifroi. Moshe wrote his book, O Parshas Balaam, and Moses also wrote the Parsha of Balaam, the story of Balaam, which is this whole story that we mentioned about Balak and Balaam. V'Iyov, and he also wrote Job. And then it says, Yeshua Kosav Sifroi. Joshua wrote his book, the book of Joshua. And Ushmoina Psukim Shabbat, and also 8 verses in the Torah. What were the 8 verses in the Torah that he wrote? Those were the last 8 verses in Deuteronomy, which talk about the death of Moses. And according to this opinion, that was not written by Moses, but those 8 verses were written by Joshua. That is one opinion which is found in the Talmud. That is, these last 8 verses were written by Joshua. There is another opinion which is found in the Talmud, and that is these 8 verses were actually written by Moses, dictated by God, and he wrote it with tears. Anyway, let's leave that discussion about who wrote the last 8 verses for a moment. And let's go back to the fact that it says that Moses wrote his book. It doesn't say his books. It says his book. And according to Heschel, that means that Moses wrote the book of Deuteronomy. Others disagree and think it means that he wrote the entire 5 books of Moses. Be that as it may. But it also seems to need to add that Moses also wrote this story of Balaam, as if we would think that somebody else wrote it. And the similar thing is with Job. So I'm going to make an argument here and say that in this brisa, in this Tannaitic piece of literature, there are 2 parts to it. Part number 1 is that Moses wrote the story of Balaam. It feels the need to say that. The other part of it is, it says that Moses did not write the last 8 verses. What do these 2 things have in common? Well, first of all, the story of Balaam doesn't feature Moses at all. It's actually a story that Moses could not have been witness to. It happened in a foreign country. How would Moses have known about this story of Balak being afraid of the Jewish people, and then going to Balaam, and Balaam talking to God? I mean, how would he have known that? He wasn't witness to it. That's the first thing. Similarly, how would he have known about his death? So in other words, these 2 things are related. We've got 2 parts of the Torah that do not have a natural way of Moses knowing about it. If we're talking about Genesis and Exodus, Genesis, well, he could have known about that because these are stories which could have been passed down through the Israelites, and therefore Moses would have known them firsthand from his ancestors. So he could have written that down in that way. What about the story of Balaam? That's from outside of the Israelites. That's not something he could have either known from his own internal culture, and also he could not have known of that from being a witness to it. What about the last 8 verses in Deuteronomy? Again, that was posthumous. It was after he died, and therefore Moses couldn't have known about it. So we've got 2 parts of the Torah which Moses could not have known about. Either one because he was dead, the other one because he wasn't witness to it and it wasn't from within his tradition. So the question is, who wrote them? And therefore the Talmud says, well, one was written by Moses himself, and the other was written by Joshua. So now there's another part to this, which is Job. It says that Moses also wrote Job, the story of Eov. The story of Eov is a well-known story of this person called Eov, who God thinks that there's no one greater, no one more dedicated to God than Job. And Satan comes along and says, well, I can prove to you, if you let me, that he's not that dedicated to you. And God basically gives him carte blanche to prove that, do everything to him, just don't kill him, and to get him to actually curse God. So that's basically the story of Job. Go and read it yourself in the book of Job. But there's a question is, well, Moses wrote that. It's a similar kind of question to the story of Balaam, because Job doesn't seem to be a Jewish person. As a matter of fact, he also seems to live outside of the Jewish community. It's actually not even clear. And the Talmud talks about when did he live, at what time period did he live. Some people say that he lived in the times of the spies. Some people say he lived in the time of Abraham. And this is also a story which came outside tradition, and how would have Moses known it? Similar to the story of Balaam. So there are 3 texts which they say Moses wrote. And within this brisa, within this Tannaitic text, they're actually talking about 4 texts in this context. So 3 that Moses wrote and 1 that Joshua wrote. The 3 that Moses wrote was Sifroi, his book, and we're not clear whether that means the book of Deuteronomy or all 5 books. The story of Balaam, which he wrote, and the book of Job, which it says that Moses wrote. And then part of Deuteronomy is these last 8 verses, which it says that Joshua wrote. Now, what do all these have in common? Well, 3 of the 4, what they have in common is that it wasn't possible for Moses to actually have been witness to them. So how could he have written them? So one of them we say he didn't write. Those were the last 8 verses of Deuteronomy. The other 2, though, he couldn't have been witness to them, but he still wrote them. Well, it's really interesting because there's another opinion in the Talmud, which is found in Bava Batra Daf Tesvav, which says that Job loy haya v'loy nivra. He never existed. Job never existed. And the whole story is just a mashal. It's just a parable. So, according to that opinion, it was just a parable. So Moses was writing a parable about somebody. Then there's a question, 1 second. If it's a parable, why does it mention the name of Job and the place where he lived? It says specifically about Job. Here we go. It says, Ish hayo be'eretz Utz, Eov shmoy. There was a man in the land of Utz, and his name was Eov. So the question which is asked from Shmuel ben Achmeni to the rabbi who says that Eov, Job, didn't exist, but this whole thing is just a parable, he says, 1 second, it says his name and it says where he came from. So if it says his name and it says where he came from, then how could it be a parable? So the answer which is given by this rabbi is by quoting a text or a verse found in Samuel 2, which is also, everyone would agree, is a parable. So the retort is, there are parables in the Bible, and this is just another one of those parables. Job is a parable, and there are other parables in the Bible. And then Shmuel ben Achmeni then says, but 1 second, in that parable, in the parable in Samuel, it doesn't say the name of the person, whereas here it says the name of the person. And it leaves it at that. So it's not clear what the conclusion is. But it seems to me, the first rabbi says 2 things. He says, A, that Job didn't exist. And secondly, it's a parable. Shmuel ben Achmeni then retorts and says, 1 second, Lecha Amakra, on you, the verse says, Ish haya be'eretz Utz, Eov shmoy. There was a man in the land of Utz, and Eov was his name. In other words, he's saying that you're saying that he didn't exist. 1 second. It says that he existed. In other words, he's not arguing on whether it's a parable or not. He's arguing on whether Job existed as a human being or not. And it seems like he's saying that, well, there are other parables in the Tanakh from Samuel. And that parable doesn't have the person's specific name. Okay, that might be a good argument to say that Job actually existed, because it says his real name. But it doesn't seem to disregard the idea that there was a parable here. So it could be that Job existed as a human being, and he was maybe someone who was well known at some time. And then, with literary license, if you like, Moses took this person and created a fictional story about him in order to teach a lesson. And in fact, if you look in the Guide to the Perplexed, the 3rd section, chapter 22, Perik Chof Beis and Chof Gimel, Maimonides is very clear that he thinks the whole of Job is a parable, and as a matter of fact, he also thinks that part of the parable is this idea of the land of Utz, and Eov was his name. That's actually part of the parable. And he doesn't think that Utz is a real place, etc., and you can look there what he says. But he thinks that that idea is also part of the parable. But he certainly accepts the idea from the Talmud that Job was a parable. And maybe Job existed, maybe didn't exist, but it doesn't matter. The story is a parable to teach us the providence of God. So now, how does this take us back to the story of Balaam? Well, it seems to me that if Job was written by Moses and it was a parable, perhaps Job existed as a human being, perhaps he didn't exist, but let's say he actually existed, and it seems from the Talmud's arguing that it says that there was a man from the land of Utz and his name was Job, so we must take that at face value that man existed. So if that's the case, he existed, but it could still be a parable. Literary license. We use a person who is real, and then we tell a story about that person, which is a parable. In other words, it doesn't have to be factual. This is a parable about a real person to teach us something, but it's not actually factual. And perhaps it's exactly the same thing with Balaam. The story of Balaam and Balak Moses could have written it in the same way he wrote Job. Balaam and Balak, perhaps they were real people, perhaps they actually existed, but the story is a parable. The story is telling us something about how much God loves the Jewish people, how much God doesn't want the Jewish people to be cursed. This was the way Moses was writing a story, a love letter to the Jewish people, if you like, a love letter about the relationship between God and the Jewish people, how God protects the Jewish people even when the Jewish people might not know about it. It seems to me from the Talmud, if you put these things together, that the Talmud is indicating the possibility that the story of Balaam and Balak actually didn't happen. It's a parable. And it equates it to the story of Job. Moses wrote them. What's the chiddush? What's the novelty that Moses wrote them? Why do we have to say Moses wrote them? And the answer is because these are both stories, again, that Moses could not have known. So how did he know them? Well, Job, that's a parable. Balaam, perhaps also a parable. Written by Moses. Parables written by Moses to teach us something unique. A lot of people don't like the idea that any part of the Torah might not be what they call true. But the whole idea of this podcast is that we teach truths rather than the truth. And I've discussed many times that I don't believe the Torah was here to tell us any kind of empirical reality about anything anyway. So it's no great revelation to me that there might be parts of the Torah which are not factual and they're just parables. Doesn't matter, it's still trying to convey some truths to us. And those truths are eternal. They're always there. That's why they're truths. So that's what it's trying to convey to us. But it's also very instructive to us to understand that the rabbis were perfectly okay with this idea of whole sections of the Torah not being factual. They were fine with that. They even hinted to that. There were discussions about that. They were okay with the idea that, one second, you got the last 8 verses. Those were written by Joshua. The rest was written by Moses. And even how much of it was actually written by Moses? It's interesting that it says Sifroi, his book. Abraham Joshua Herschel thinks that is just the book of Deuteronomy, of Devarim. Other people are of the opinion that it means all 5 books of Moses. But one could definitely argue that the singular, where it says Sifroi, his book, could be just the one book. Who wrote the rest? It's an interesting question. I know tradition sees it all have been written by Moses. But the reality is, even if it was all written by Moses, that doesn't mean that Moses wrote everything in a factual manner. Whole sections of it could have been parables and therefore not factual. This has been Levi Brackman with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining, and until next time.